Hey guys, almost any endgame can be simplified and turned into a pawn's endgame. That's why you will have a huge advantage if you study this kind of endings. Today we are going to solve pawn's endgames in Tactics Trainer, and I will be explaining the solution and highlighting instructive concepts we can see in the puzzles. Keep watching. If you want to make a pause in the puzzles and think for some seconds or 1 minute by yourself, it's going to be a very good exercise. Well, let's see. This time we're playing as black. This pawn's advance over here, and let's see how's the best way to play. Well, it seems to be pretty easy to get a draw here. We can just trade and play king here, and we are getting a second pawn, and it should be a draw. However, maybe we can get more than just a draw. So pawn takes pawn seems to be the first move. We are losing that pawn, so it's a capture, something we need to keep in mind. And then we're assuming white is going to recapture. We could analyze our options, but the first option is king takes pawn, and then we will play king h4, wanting to capture here. White can play king e4, also wanting to capture our pawn. And well, as I said, I can capture and get a draw, but maybe we can just play king g3, protecting the pawn, advancing, and maybe we could be winning this endgame. After king g3 there is h4, we can play f3, h5, f2, h6, and promotion, and we are winning the endgame. So let's analyze, let's make sure we're not missing anything. Pawn takes pawn. Also there is this move h4 check. That's interesting, because if we capture the pawn, white can capture here and then come back later to get our pawn somewhere on the d file. So pawn takes pawn h4. What do we play then? Well, after pawn takes pawn h4, the best move I can find is just king g4, and then white could be promoting with h5, f3, h6, f2, h7, and f1 promoting to queen, and h8 promoting to queen. So we are both getting a queen, but we have a pawn here on d4. For example, we can give a check here on e2. That's very interesting, because if he captures, there will be a skewer over here. We're calculating many moves here, not sure how well you're analyzing this long variation, but the idea is that after this check, the king cannot capture the pawn. We have to go back, and then we will have a pawn advancing. It's a queen's endgame with an extra pawn, so it should be winning the endgame because the pawn is just too advanced. But well, let's see how they play after we capture the pawn. Yeah, h4 is the move, and then we set king g4, and then we set here f3, right? f2, and then promotion. And yeah, they stop here. They stop the analysis here. The line I was saying, after promotion, I guess we can give a check here, because if white captures, we have a skewer getting the queen, and if the king goes back after the check, then we are pushing very quickly our pawn. So that's the best line I can see here for black, and it should be winning for black. Let's go to the next. Okay, white to move here, and this is an endgame. We have 4 pawns versus 4 pawns. Black king is much more active, but also black has some trouble over here in the structure in the king side. The first thing I was thinking was just to play king c2 and try to face this king. But also something we need to keep in mind when we are playing pawns endgames is the possibility to create passed pawns. That's usually a very important detail we need to keep in mind. And actually we have the possibility to create one passed pawn here. There is this move g4, creating a passed pawn on the h file. After g4, black has some ways to play. One of them is just go to get our pawn on the a file, but I don't think they are going to be promoting in time. So let's see, g4, king g3, sorry, king b3, pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn, h6, king comes back to b3 maybe, h7, and yeah, we're promoting clearly before black promotes. So g4 coming over here is not working. Maybe let's analyze the other line. Pawn takes pawn, and then king d5. We can capture. King e5. We can push. King f6. And in this position, if we continue advancing, he will capture. But there is a beautiful move. It is this move h5. And then black is going to be in Suxuan in that position. The king will have to get out of the square. The square of this pawn on h6 will be like this. And this king will have to go back away from the square. And then our pawn is going to be promoting. We are going to see that very clearly, because I think that's the line the engine is going to play. Well, they stopped here, but the idea is that we are going to promote very quickly, and after g3 we are going to stop this pawn. I mean, this pawn is going to be controlled by our king, as this pawn won't be controlled by black king. Let's go to the next. Okay, black to move here. We have 2 pawns versus 1 pawn. In general, in pawns endgames, with 1 pawn up we are winning, but with more pawns on the board. When it is like 2 versus 1, or sometimes 3 against 2, maybe it's not so clear. But let's analyze this. The first move I can think of is king g3, putting the king very active, attacking the pawn, and he's going to play king g1, seems to be the only move. And then there is another line, another interesting move, and it is h3. And well, after h3, white has some options, but pawn takes pawn seems to be like the best, because if the king, instead of taking the pawn, white plays king here, we could be playing pawn takes pawn, and yeah, we're getting the pawn and we are winning that endgame. So king g3, king g1, h3, pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn. In this position we can stop calculating, because there is a principle or a rule which is going to help us to evaluate the endgame. In that position we have the king on the 6th rank before the pawn. Every time in a king and pawn versus king endgame, you can put the king in the 6th rank before the pawn, then you are winning the endgame for every pawn except for rook pawns. So we don't have to calculate anything else. After we capture here, we know it's winning for sure, because the 6th rank principle states it. So let's play it. King g3, and then h3, and then I take with the pawn, right? I mean with the king, right? Okay, and then the king is in the 6th rank before the pawn. Let's go to the next. Okay, this is king and 2 pawns versus king and 2 pawns. White has a very dangerous passed pawn over here, so probably the first move has to be king takes a5. After king takes a5, I'm assuming white is going to play king c6. It seems to be the best move. And then we have this idea, sacrificing this pawn to get the passed pawn over here. And after d4, pawn takes pawn, e3, there is d5, e2, d6, we promote, and d7. Well, this endgame is king and queen versus king and pawn. The pawn is a central pawn, so every time we're playing king and queen versus king and pawn in the 7th rank, if it is a central pawn or a knight pawn, is winning for sure. That's another endgame we should study at some point. It is in my channel, king and queen versus king and pawn, and is actually going to be winning for white more or less easily. I mean for black. So I'm going to play it because it seems to be more or less clear. So king takes pawn and then d4, and then we promote first and we win. Let's see the next. Okay, 3 pawns versus 3 pawns. Our king is a little more active. The first line I can look at here is this idea of going to g3. It seems like after this plan, white needs to go over here. And then as our king is much more active, we can take advantage of this situation. There is this move h3 destroying the connection, isolating the pawns, and after pawn takes pawn, we can capture this pawn, because then for sure we will capture the other pawn. So we're getting a pawn up with this line of king f4, king g3, and a3. Once we have the pawn up, it should be more or less easy to win. Exactly. Also, the king is going to be more than one rank in front of the pawn, so probably we can even win over here. We won't even have to go to the queen side. Let's see this on the board. So king f4, king g3, and h3 is the move we set. Here we can capture here or here, but if we capture here, he will be defending this one more or less easily. And if we do it in the other way, like king takes pawn, trying to get this pawn, he won't be able to defend the pawn on h3. So we capture here on f3, much better. One of the best things, or one of the good things we can highlight, is the king was much more active in this endgame. So that's like a good advantage. If you can put your king in a better position, much more active, it could be decisive in some pawns endgames. Okay, we're playing as white here, and well, right now we have the option to simplify and turn this into a pawn's endgame. Let's see how good that is for us. So rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, and then we have some moves like king here or like king takes pawn. King takes pawn seems to be very interesting because we are removing the pawn, which means we have to pass pawns over here, which is great. And we keep our king in the square of the pawn, of that pawn on d4, which means the pawn is going to be still controlled. So let's analyze. Rook takes rook, pawn takes, king takes pawn. If he advances, it's not really a problem because the king is controlling. But he can still, instead of advancing, he can play king e5. We can just come back very quickly to block that pawn. King e4, king c2. And once we are blocking the pawn, it seems to be very clear. These two pawns protect each other. He will never be able to capture one pawn because the other will be like promoting. So as I said, they protect each other, and our king can be pushing, and they could be advancing slowly, and we're going to be winning that endgame. That's right, so let's play it. So rook takes rook, and king takes pawn. We come back very quickly to make sure this pawn is not going to be a problem. We block, and once we have the pawn very well blocked, our pawns will be advancing, and if the king goes in time over here, we can capture these pawns, and then the king will help the connected pawns to continue advancing. Okay, white to move here. We have a pawn down. One more time, we have something very good, and it is that our king is way more active, also is way closer to the enemy pawns. So of course we want to threaten these pawns. The first move is the most logical move is king e7, but probably is a mistake because black can play f5, and then they are getting the passed pawn promoting very soon. So probably king e7 is not the best move. However, we can do the same idea, like get closer to the pawns, but over here, just to make sure black is not playing f5, or if they play it, they lose a pawn. It seems to be more or less clear that we could be winning with king e5. Exactly, let's play it. King e5. Here we get the extra pawn, and then we will have a rook pawn, but our king can come in time to g7, to the square 2 knight, and when that happens, we will be blocking the enemy king. So if we are like creating a wall, and then our pawn is going to be safe going to promotion. Let's see this on the board. So king takes. Well, they stop the line here, but usually when you have a rook pawn, the rook pawns are very likely to end in a draw. Usually the defense is more or less simple. Sometimes even with the king away from the promotion square, they can get a draw. However, if the strong side can put the king into knight, usually it's going to be winning, because of this idea I said, because of that idea of the wall. So let's see the next. Well, here we are playing as black. We have one more time the option of simplifying, but the question is, how good is that for us? Well, bishop takes bishop, pawn takes bishop. We cannot create any, we cannot play anything crazy like king here because he's promoting. So the idea here could be like going down. So we want to capture those pawns, but over the right way, just to make sure this pawn is not promoting. So bishop takes and king f6. Then white could be playing king g3, and then we could be playing king e7. White could be playing king f4. We go here. He can take our pawn on f5, and we can take the pawn on d5. Anything white plays, we are going to capture the pawn on d4. And here there is another thing we need to keep in mind in pawns endgames, and it is how close our king is to the rest of the pawns. And after I capture here, my king, my black king, is going to be way closer to his pawns than white king to my pawns. So that could be decisive here. I think we could be winning the endgame if we play that way. Exactly, so let's play it. And then, as I said, the king is closer, so we capture, and we should be winning this endgame. Okay, black to move. We have 3 versus 3. One more time, king more active is the main advantage we have in this endgame, or the only advantage we have in this position. So how do we win this? Well, the first move we can analyze is king g4, and then white can play king f2. Then what? Well, there's a funny way to lose after king g4, king f2. If we play f5, white is going to play king g2, and then our king is like stalemated, but we have one move. We can still play g5, and then we're going to lose the pawn and the endgame. So that's like a funny mistake. King g4, king f2, f5, losing the endgame after king g2. So let's see, king g4, king f2, and king h3. Then what? He has to play king f3. Then we can play king h2, king f2. We still have the king way more active, and at some point we will play f5. The king will come back and we'll play king g1. Exactly, that's the idea. The idea is that the king will have to move, and then we're playing king e2 and getting the pawn. So let's organize the lines. So king g4, king f2. We need to play king h3, and white needs to play king f3. In that position, we need to use this tempo of f5, and white will play king f2, king h2, and then king f3, and then king u1. Yeah. So the idea is that our king is like going to do some kind of rodeo over here, and then we will be getting g2. That's what we need. Once we get g2, we get the pawn. So let's see this on the board. So king g4, then king h3, and then there is this idea with f5. Okay. So this is not like the line we were analyzing, so let's make a pause here. It seems clear that we need to capture on f5, and white is going to play king f3. But then what? Well, then we can play just king here. If the king comes here, we play king g2. He takes pawn. We take pawn, and we are winning. Okay. So pawn takes pawn. King here. King h2. And then maybe the best move is king f2, but we can still play f4. Exactly. If he captures, then he has two isolated pawns over here, and our king is going to be capturing those pawns. So we take first, we play king h2, and then we are winning with that move. Okay, king and 2 pawns versus king and 2 pawns. The first line we can see here is like a king d4 wanting to play king e5. In the endgame, if we can capture or threaten pawns, is usually very well. And the other thing always very well is to advance past pawns. So I mean, those are like our two great plans we can always have: capture or attack the enemy pawns, or try to advance the passed pawn. Safely advance the passed pawn. So king d4 is like the first move I can think of, and after king c6, king e5, one more time the king is way more active, and this is going to be decisive. After king e5, black can play king d7, and we can destroy this connection, so that we separate those pawns, so they are very weak. So there is this move f5, and we are taking the pawn, so black has to capture, and here we can capture here or here, but the right capture is going to be the one on d5, so we can capture very quietly the pawn on f5 later, and then we're going to be winning the endgame. Exactly. So let's play it. So king d4, king e5, and then we set f5, creating weaknesses, and then we capture this pawn, no, the other pawn, king d5, and then king e5 and king f5. The king is more than one rank in front of the passed pawn, so that's always winning. So every time you're playing king and pawn versus king, and your king goes more than one rank in front, your king gets one of these squares, you're going to be winning the endgame. Okay, the question for today: what did you learn in this video? Let me know in the comments. So I hope you have enjoyed this video. Help my channel with some like if it was like that. Subscribe so you get notifications for my next videos. Never stop believing. See you in the next.